Anyways, okay, here we go. Okay, so what to start with? French and Indian War. Who's fighting who?
Is it England?
French versus the British. And who wins?
The British.
The British. Okay. And even though they win, they still are in heavy debt, right? And so the British are going to look for ways to pay off that debt. Okay. And this is going to lead us to a lot of economic policies that are going to affect the colonies. I'm gonna make like a t-shirt. So we're going to see a series of policies that Parliament is going to create that is designed to pay off the debt, to gather more money for itself. Okay. Remember, they follow a mercantilism economic system. That's where we have a mother country that uses its colonies to gain wealth. Okay, that's like the 2-second definition. So they're going to use the colonies to gain wealth to pay off the debt. And there's lots of different policies that we talked about in class to raise money. Can we think of some examples of that? Stamp Act, right? Where they say in order to get these official documents, you need to have a stamp and pay money for that stamp to read them. What else? What was that? Not necessarily tariffs.
The currency.
Currency Act, yeah, you can do that. We didn't really talk about it in class, but yeah, Currency Act is another one. What else? What's that? Intolerable acts? Yeah, that's going to come later. I'm going to add that down here just because we'll.
The Sugar Act.
Sugar Act, definitely. Right, where they're trying to make the colonies trade only with them for sugar. Townshend Acts, where they put a tax on like specific things. These are excise taxes, stuff like paper, glass, tea. What was the response to these laws? Like, how did the colonists respond to this? What did they do in response? What arguments did they make? Okay, so they didn't like it. So what did they do? Or what did they say? Okay, so we see a lot of smuggling. What else? What else did they do? To protest or to get around it? Okay, so we have violence, the form of burning in effigies. Okay. We also have violence in the form of tar and feathering. What else? What else do they do? Boycotting, yeah. This was especially what was done like early on. Okay. Sugar Act is the first one. This is a boycott. They started boycotting British sugar. Townshend Act, they started boycotting British products. So this comes first, earliest, and the violence comes later. You could talk about Enlightenment ideas. The idea that people have natural rights. They argued that they said no taxation without representation. I'm gonna add something over here to political policies. But when the colonists said, hey, we don't want taxation if we don't get representation, how did Parliament respond to that? Does anyone remember what term they used? That's in your study. What was the British response to that? Full representation. All British subjects are already represented. Don't worry, all the representatives in Parliament are already working for you. I think I gave the example of like teachers making the homecoming theme, but they don't include any of the students like actually planning it. Oh, don't worry, we're trying to come up with something that you want. Well, that's not okay if we don't actually have students on that decision making, right? So violence is going to begin once more and more British soldiers come to colonies, right? In response to the boycotts and the violence, Parliament will send soldiers to the colonies. They're going to enact the Quartering Act. Does anyone remember what that one said?
That, like, the soldiers on the.
They have to provide housing for soldiers. That's expensive. That costs money. And the big, I guess I'm gonna add like Boston. All right, so we have this kind of back and forth. Parliament does one thing, colonists respond. Parliament does this next thing, colonists respond. The Parliament sends soldiers to Boston, and the big event that we're going to see with them is the Boston Massacre. And so this isn't going to help. It's going to inflame things more. So we see more protests against things like the paper tax, the glass tax, the tea tax. But ultimately, Parliament gets rid of all of those policies except for the tea tax, right? And that leads to what? Where they destroy all the tea. Then that leads to the Intolerable Acts, right? This is punishing them. And Intolerable Acts actually fits in both. Remember what was the big economic part of the Intolerable Acts? What they do as a punishment to Boston? They closed Boston Harbor. They closed the port of Boston. What was the big political punishment to the coercive acts? Or Intolerable Acts? No town meetings. This led colonies, especially Massachusetts, to start collecting weapons to defend themselves, right? That's where we have Minutemen, right? And ultimately that leads to the British trying to take weapons from the colonies. And that leads to the first conflict. So remember what the first conflict, where the first conflict was? Lexington and Concord. So the British are going to send even more soldiers to Boston specifically. We have like 13,000 soldiers now in Boston. We have conflict. And so that's when the colonies will respond again in the Second Continental Congress. At this point, they're still wondering how can we get our rights back until we see one colonist write a book that's really important. What was that important book? Common Sense. And so we see fighting against the colonial soldiers, leading to stuff like this Republican value. Remember we talked about that in our activity we did where we organized the materials? The fighting led to Thomas Paine saying, hey, maybe we do need independence. Maybe we do need self-government. At this point, now with the fighting, they have Parliament decided that the colonies are in open rebellion, meaning the war is going to start getting even bigger, more soldiers, big battles. So if the colonists were saying like, oh, we were just minding our own business, and then Parliament is being mean to us and fighting us, what would Parliament say in response to the colonies being like, we didn't do anything we didn't do anything to start this, you started it? What would Parliament say in response to that? Would they agree? No. Why? What did the colonists do that was mean back to the British? Destroyed property. What else? What else? What else did the colonists do that instigated fighting and things getting worse? That we've talked about over on this list over here. Boycotts. Instigating means it leads to, it's causing problems. Boycotts. That led to problems. What else? What else did the colonists do that's going to start a fight? Violence, right? Them attacking and tarring, feathering British officials leads to more fighting, right? So the colonies aren't necessarily clean in all of this, or not necessarily innocent in all of this, but they're going to argue things like we deserve self-government because they're not listening to us. We need more power for ourselves. Remember, over and over again, throughout this time period, there are very few people who actually want independence. Almost always they're talking about how can we regain our rights. Even after things like the Townshend Acts, the First Continental Congress is not talking about independence. They're talking about how they can regain their rights. Many are wanting a compromise. Who's the group of people who want compromise and want to follow what the king says? What are they called? Someone said it. Loyalists. Loyalists. So if you were, and I think we gave this as an example on when we were talking about the activity, if you were writing an essay about how British policies lead to independence or lead to Republican values, a counter argument would be the loyalists, right? The loyalists are people who are seeing these policies and don't want self-government and don't want independence. So they're an example of a counter argument you could use in a hypothetical situation where you have to write an essay about.
Oh, what? Well, how policies change.
Yeah, that's from our activity that we did. Common sense is also Enlightenment ideas. So over and over again, we're seeing Parliament and a strong central government exerting more control over the colonies. Guys, you listening?
Yeah.
I might just like myself. Are you listening? Okay. I don't just do this for my health. So we have a strong central government who is exerting more and more power over the colonies, and this makes the colonies upset. And ultimately, when they win the war and they need to make their own country, they want to avoid a strong central government for the future. So what's the name of the document that they create to avoid a strong central government? The Articles of Confederation is written while the war is still going on, when they're still concerned about a strong central government. That's why they take all the power away from the strong national government and give it to the states instead. Okay? So here we have a connection. During the war, they're afraid of a strong national government. So when the war is done, they're ready to make their own government. They don't give the national government very much power. Instead, they give that to the states. Questions on that? Let's see. The only other thing I want to talk about, like during the war, is things like women's involvement. How are women involved during the war?
They took care of the farm.
They took care of farms. They took care of businesses. They produced supplies for the army. Made clothes for them. Let's see. We talked about one example of a revolutionary era woman who's fighting for her rights. I remember who that was. Abigail Adams. And she gave her famous line, which was, "Remember the ladies," insisting on equal rights, especially property rights for women. But especially women who are back at home, they're suffering from high inflation during the war. So like they made like paper currency, paper money, but because inflation, it was almost worthless because wars are expensive. In the beginning part of the war, many Southerners are loyalists. Do you remember what the big thing that changed many Southerners' minds from being loyalists to being patriots? It was when the British government started offering freedom to enslaved people for fighting for the British Army. That convinced many Southerners to switch from being loyalists to being patriots.
So loyalists were loyal to the British government.
Yes.
Patriots, like,
Patriots want independence. Okay. Questions before we finish up today? Anything on the study guide or anything from here that you're like, wait, can you talk about this for a second? Okay, great. I will stop the video right there.